CTV's Rachel Ayalo drills down on calls for Canada to ramp up exports in response to this change in the energy environment.
The most competitive oil and gas in the world. Our oil exports have never been higher. Under this government, over 5 million barrels per day, and they will increase because they will be low carbon, low cost, low risk. Under this government, production has never been so high. Exports have never been so high. We approve Bay du Nord. We are working with the province of Alberta to produce the lowest cost, lowest carbon oil and gas. We are expanding our exports. We are expanding our future.
For the first time in history, America is begging Canada for help. Oil help, the emergency kind, the desperate kind. They asked for rescue, and Canada went silent. Not polite silence, but cold and calculating silence. America always assumed Canada would say yes. But that assumption just died today, as Canada is deciding if saving America is even worth it. Let's establish what triggered this. Iran started laying mines in the Strait of Hormuz last night. Not a massive deployment yet, just a few dozen so far. But Iran retains between 80 and 90% of its mine-laying capability. That means hundreds more could appear within days. The IRGC warned that any vessel passing through the strait would face attack. The channel has been described as a death valley, and that strait carries 1/5 of the world's oil supply. It has been effectively closed for over a week. The global economy is catching fire, and America's best response so far, we are looking at options. Looking at options while everything burns. Here is the part most coverage is missing. The US Strategic Petroleum Reserve sits at historic lows. Joe Biden drained it during the Ukraine war. Donald Trump refused to refill it. Now, there is nothing left to deploy without exposing the economy to catastrophic risk. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has already given up on principle. He is ready to lift sanctions on Russian oil just to ease the temporary gap. Suddenly, the punishments on Russia do not matter anymore. Putin now has enormous leverage. He can dictate terms. Russia became untouchable overnight. But even that does not solve the immediate crisis, because oil hit $119 per barrel before retreating to around $107 after rumors spread that reserve releases were being discussed. That retreat was temporary and insufficient, and everyone in the markets knows it. So America turned to Europe first, begged for coordinated reserve releases. The G7 held emergency meetings to discuss synchronized action. They walked away with nothing. The European Union told member states this week there is currently no justification to release strategic oil stocks, even as the Iran war continues hammering key shipping lanes. French officials said they are ready to take necessary steps, but admitted we are not there yet. Germany stated it supports keeping the option available, but emphasized now is not the right time to use it. Nobody knows when the right time actually is. What we do know is this: Europe learned from Ukraine that America starts wars and expects Europe to pay the price. This time, they're refusing. European Energy Commissioner Dan Jorgensen wrote publicly that Europe's energy system is better prepared and far more resilient today. Our energy sources are more diverse and cleaner, he said. That was not reassurance. It was a victory lap. Europe is essentially declaring, we protected ourselves, you did not, now you are on your own. The financial mechanism behind this is vicious. The US economy runs 70% on consumption. Americans drive everywhere. Cheap gas is basically oxygen for the entire system. Oil at $110 per barrel means gas prices spiking to $4 or $5 per gallon within weeks. Consumer spending collapses and retail earnings crash, and the S&P 500 follows. Europe's economy is 50% consumption-based. They have public transport networks. They have strategic gas reserves that actually function. Europe can absorb a price spike for several months. America cannot. And here is where Canada enters the equation. The IEA held an emergency meeting of its 32 member states to assess whether to release emergency stocks. The IEA collectively holds 1.2 billion barrels of oil in reserve. But those reserves are nationally controlled. The IEA can recommend a release, but it cannot force one. And that is where America's assumption about automatic Canadian cooperation starts cracking. Because Canada is doing the same math. Europe already finished. The shortfall from the Strait of Hormuz closure is roughly 20 million barrels per day. If the G7 released 20 million barrels daily from reserves, they could cover the gap for about 20 days, release 10 million barrels daily, and stretch it to 40 days. Then what happens? Reserves run out, Iran is still there, the Strait is still mined, and the US economy is still struggling. Canada knows this math, and Canada is watching how Europe responded. Global markets stumbled hard Monday. Japan's Nikkei plunged more than 5% after oil spiked near $120. South Korea's Kospi sank 6%. Taiwan's benchmark dropped 4.4%. The S&P 500 fell roughly 1%. But here's the detail. European markets fell too, but not as hard. The FTSE lost 1.9%. Germany's DAX dropped 2.6%. Painful, yes, but survivable. Europe has cushions, America does not. And Canada is positioned somewhere between those two extremes, with resources America desperately needs, but no obligation to deploy them on America's terms. Europe's gas storage levels are lower than recent years. 46 billion cubic meters at the end of February compared to 60 billion in 2025 and 77 billion in 2024. Even at reduced levels, Europe can weather this. Meanwhile, US natural gas is relatively insulated because American export terminals are running at maximum capacity. That means the US literally cannot help its European allies even if it wanted to. Europe knows this, Canada knows this, and both understand that if the US releases oil reserves, Asian buyers would bid up the price immediately. American drivers would see minimal relief. European and Canadian refiners would get nothing, so why help? The Trump administration even floated deploying special forces to seize Iran's uranium stockpile. Hundreds of troops digging up enriched uranium in an active war zone. When that leaked, it became clear there is no strategy, only escalation. Donald Trump is begging China to buy American oil instead of Iranian crude. The pitch itself reveals how desperate things have become. And now, America is turning to Canada with the same request it made to Europe: release your strategic reserves to stabilize our markets. Help us absorb this crisis. Be the ally we have always assumed you would be. But Canada spent the last year watching how America treated allies. Trade disputes, tariff threats, unilateral military action without consultation, and the assumption that Canadian resources exist primarily to serve American needs. And now, America needs those resources badly. Oil at $110 per barrel for another month means US inflation rises to 3.5% or higher. Federal Reserve rate cuts become nearly impossible. The S&P 500 could drop another 10 to 20%. Analysts are putting 95% probability on stocks either stagnating or crashing outright. Canada's calculation is not about punishment. It is about self-interest. Canadian oil producers finally have leverage and pricing power. Asian markets are willing to pay premium rates for stable supply. Why would Canada drain its strategic position to stabilize American gas prices when doing so would surrender the negotiating advantage Canada spent years building? European Commission energy officials are calling for the bloc to double down on energy transition and continue expanding clean, homegrown, renewable energy. That is code for "we are done depending on you." Canada is watching that message closely. The US economy was already cracking before Iran mined the Strait. February payrolls went negative for the first time in years. Tariffs were compressing margins. The Federal Reserve had little room to cut rates without stoking inflation. Now add oil at $110. Fertilizer prices up 25%. Aluminum facing force majeure shutdowns. The picture gets uglier by the day. And the country that started a war it cannot win assumed European support it never had, and is now discovering that without allies willing to sacrifice their own interests, American power is a mirage. Iran laid mines in the Strait last night. Europe shrugged. And when America turned to Canada with the same desperate request, Canada has not answered yet. Not because Canada cannot, but because Canada is calculating whether it should. That silence is the sound of the transatlantic alliance dying in real time. And Canada deciding that protecting its own position matters more than rescuing America from consequences America created. The request went out, the answer has not come back, and that delay tells you everything about how the power dynamic just shifted. America is begging, Canada is thinking, and nobody saw this coming.